Hello everyone and welcome back to this working lunch. Je tiens évidemment à remercier le Premier ministre Garrett d'assurer la coprésidence de cette réunion avec moi. Et je veux vous présenter Chrystia Freeland, notre vice-première ministre, qui va agir comme modératrice. I want to introduce to you all our Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who is going to be moderating this session. I'm also glad to be joined by Ministers Hussein and Guilbeault for this session on the global financial architecture reform and access to finance. CARICOM is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and in that time, so much has changed. But multilateral organizations like this are what we need for moments like the one we're living through right now. It's important to have productive conversations like this one about our shared future and how we meet essential financing needs as we face this moment and make progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And this flows directly from the conversations we just had this morning, a really important and excellent discussion on climate change that, of course, talks about the need to flow better capital and better financing supports to countries like in the Caribbean, but around the world, to be able to both take on the challenges of building more resilient infrastructure in the face of more extreme climate events, but also harness the opportunities that come with cleaner, cheaper energy as we make significant transitions around the world. Notre rencontre a lieu à un moment où on fait face à des défis énormes qui nous frappent simultanément, des défis qui se répercutent à l'échelle mondiale. Les changements climatiques, les crises de santé publique, les perturbations des chaînes d'approvisionnement et les tensions géopolitiques. On sait que pour surmonter ces problèmes, les pays en développement et à revenus intermédiaires ont besoin d'un meilleur accès au financement. C'est important pour assurer les secours en cas de catastrophe, le maintien de la santé publique et la croissance économique. This is why Canada is committed to reforming and reimagining the international financing architecture. It's why we support the evolution of the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions so they are fit for purpose in a modern, interconnected world with very different challenges than those envisioned in the years following World War II by the Bretton Woods institutions. Canada supports efforts for reforms, including using their capital more efficiently, making concessional financing more available, mobilizing more private capital because we know public financing alone isn't sufficient, and we all face risks for not taking action, all the while making sure support continues to be available to the poorest countries and those most at risk. We have had a number of conversations about SDGs, and Canada is now number one in the world in terms of directing our special SDRs, our special drawing rights into places that need them, and we will continue to encourage others to use the SDRs in that way as well. I have to say, this is an issue that Canada has been leaning in on for quite a while. A number of years ago, along with Andrew Holness of Jamaica, the two of us led the way on a Financing for Development initiative through the UN that set the table for a lot of the work that is now being done. And I want to thank Andrew again for all his leadership and hard work on that initiative while we ran that through much of a pandemic as well, but it was an important conversation to have and highlighting just the great work that you've done, not just on that issue, but also on growing and having a high-performing economy in Jamaica. There's a tremendous amount of good things coming out of there. We also welcome, obviously, the contributions of the Bridgetown Initiative, which has refreshed and re-energized conversations around this important issue. Prime Minister Mottley, Mia, you and I spoke about this many times, but particularly this year when we met at the UN this past spring. Canada has joined international partners in calling for major creditors, both public and private, to offer climate-resilient debt clauses that pause debt repayments for vulnerable countries in times of crisis or catastrophe. And Canada will now offer climate-resilient debt clauses, CDRCs, CRDCs, in all new sovereign lending. We've also contributed a significant amount of our special drawing rights to the IMF's Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, including the announcement of an additional 700 million SDRs worth $1.3 billion at the UN General Assembly last month. I believe in terms of SDRs, we're up to about 48%, which is higher than anybody else. A lot of that flows to the Global South. Some of that is for Ukraine, but we are there to make sure that we are sending money to where people need them most. Both of these initiatives answer calls from the Bridgetown Initiative, but we know that this is about more than just making sure you can get through this moment of crisis and the next. It's about making sure that the Caribbean is poised to thrive, to help boost investment in the region so that your economies can innovate, modernize, and continue to grow. Governments absolutely must be able to support people in times of crisis, and they must have the financing they need to build a better future for all of your citizens. On doit s'assurer que tous les gouvernements puissent accéder au financement de manière à pouvoir servir les citoyens et investir dans de nouvelles opportunités pour tous. That's what this is all about, and I look forward to hearing your insights and inputs. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, to open up the conversation on international financing.
Thank you very much, Justin. And first of all, let me thank all of my colleagues for holding the line and us agreeing that the time for change is immediate with respect to the international financial system. Our countries have become highly indebted, not because of corruption or profligacy, but because of the complexity of governance that we face, ranging from environmental threats to the consequences of a transition to a liberalized trading environment over the last 30 years that saw the diminution of our agricultural and manufacturing sectors when others could equally sustain theirs through mechanisms that were grandfathered. And this is in spite of us having no capacity to distort the global trading system in either goods or services. We have maintained that the one-size-fits-all prescription and the victimhood of rules that are imposed on us are not of our own making, cannot continue. Up to yesterday, 2 more countries were blacklisted, and the consequences of this blacklisting continue to hurt our countries because effectively companies will de-risk as a result of the enhanced due diligence that must be put in place in order for them to continue to do business. Similarly, the correspondent banking issues continue to bedevil my brother to the right and too many of our countries as if we were financial lepers or pariahs. And the absence of the international financial institutions and the G7 and G20 countries to recognize the disproportionate consequences on our people are simply unacceptable. With respect to the World Bank and the IMF, both of whom were formed at a time when we were but colonies, we continue to make a few simple points. We welcome the new leadership at the World Bank, and we thank him for the direction that he wants to take us in. But we ask him to pause and reflect too, that the devil is in the detail, and that the bureaucracies must not be allowed to make a promise be rendered nugatory, largely because instead of having debt pause clauses for all existing debt for vulnerable countries, we are now being told that it is likely to be for future debt, which does not help Dominica tonight or Antigua tomorrow if either of the two of them are hit by the system that is coming towards them. The notion, and I think the chairman of CARICOM, he said it over and over, that within the first few days after losing 226% of his GDP, rather than being able to secure his focus on providing housing and food in the immediate restoration efforts, he had to worry about paying debt to the World Bank and other institutions. I'm saying that if this is to be meaningful, and if we are to accept the scientist's view that we are running out of time within which we can do the adaptation necessary to meet the increasing temperatures, then it cannot be for future debt, because we will have to wait another 10 to 15 years for it to have any kind of corresponding impact on our countries. Secondly, I'm told that it is going to be intended for principal alone. We cannot ask people to pay interest rates when they're supposed to be feeding people in the aftermath of a crisis. These issues at a political level are too simple. We get them, but there is a disconnect between the political level and the people who serve on the boards. And therefore, one of the things that came up in Marrakesh last week, and I hope that we can see movement on it, is that we may well need a council of ministers at both of these institutions in order to ensure that that disconnect between capital and the institution does not continue, because the world simply does not have the space left or the buffer left for the kinds of errors that come from that disconnect between those who sit on the boards. And we're not saying Catherine, because Catherine has been doing an excellent job for us, but the others who sit on the boards and who say completely different things from that which we hear when we engage with their political leaders or the political ministers of finance. With respect to the IMF, we believe that a number of things. One, that in an environment of high interest rates, the surcharges must go. There is no justification for the maintenance of surcharges in an environment of high interest rates. We recognize that the recapitalization of the MDBs, the World Bank, and the regional development banks is absolutely critical, and a lot more can be done there. One of the difficulties at the same time, however, is that while we call for access for middle-income countries, it does not in any way reduce our call for the tripling of assistance to either countries. And the reality is that we want poor countries to stop being poor, and we want to stop middle-income countries from becoming poor again. Because 70% of the world's poor do not live in poor countries. They live in middle-income countries. And therefore, any attempt to refocus the World Bank or the IMF that doesn't recognize that simple fact will have us in trouble. Put all the money in front of us that we want, and many of us still can't spend it because the debt sustainability metrics that we are using in a polycrisis are the same that we used when we faced no crises or a single crisis. And this is critical because if countries are to adapt in the next decade, if we are to get the coastal preservation that Keith spoke about this morning, rather than the spectacle of having to move populations from off the coast as refugees within the country itself, if we're to get that, then we need to be able to move now with alacrity. And I fear that the absence of political will that is reflected so clearly in the failure to ramp up the scale in terms of the recapitalization of the World Bank, 15 to 20 billion a year is not going to do it when the demands across Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the small island developing states is as comprehensive as it is. And when, as you have made the point, Justin, that there are serious issues with respect to how much you can further place public money available. That is why the Bridgetown Initiative also calls for a complete review of how we look at the World Bank. The World Bank cannot be that place that is only the recipient of public money. More than anything else, the last 70, 80 years has seen a plethora of multinational corporations develop. And while we want them to continue to thrive, they must play their part. And the global minimum corporate tax cannot be the only mechanism by which they play their part. There are global public goods that if we don't secure them, will ensure a devaluation of the quality of life of all of the world's citizens. And to that extent, we need clarity on what those global public goods can be and how we finance them. Obviously, climate, preservation of climate and biodiversity is critical. We're in Canada, and therefore the Montreal Protocol recently would have added significantly, and we thank you for your leadership on that. But if we don't move these protocols into live reality, they won't help us. And therefore, we need money, we need oxygen in order to do that globally. Secondly, we need to be able to deal with pandemic, current, and any future ones, including the silent pandemic of antimicrobial resistance that is already the third largest killer of people globally. Thirdly, conflict and war. And boy, are we seeing why we need to spend money. And the destruction of the lives and opportunities from the Sudan to the Middle East to Ukraine, it is too much for the world to carry, and we have to literally deal with the consequences of conflict, but at the same time seek to build a sustainable peace. Fourthly, food and water access. All of this fancy talk. People don't have access to food within a few days or water within a few days. Their lives are severely compromised. And finally, the one that is least talked about, but is critical for stability, dealing with the digital divide that only deepens the inequity amongst our populations. The public money will not be enough in the World Bank to solve that. But if we can, one, ensure that we have access to some kind of global mechanism for multinational corporations whose balance sheet exceeds perhaps more than half the world's countries. And if we can also have a mechanism for philanthropy to play its part, recognizing that they get to spend on what they like, but we need them to spend on what the world needs. And therein lies the difficulty. So that we have three sources of funding then: public money, private sector capital, not to bankrupt them, but to leave a little few cents on the table, and philanthropy. And we can then have a World Bank that is scaled up to help meet the needs of the world. If it doesn't happen, nature abhors a vacuum, and the vacuum will be filled in some other way, regrettably. The last point, as I said, is the debt sustainability metrics. Every country in Europe is now at a debt to GDP ratio of 90%. And the 60% used as the standard clearly does not work for us now. When I ask why Europe hasn't changed, it has probably more to do with the difficulty in amending treaties rather than anything else. But if we continue to insist at the IMF and at the World Bank, and by the credit rating agencies who really have to become part of the conversation, that we go to a metric that is too steep while fighting polycrises, then we literally collapse the capacity of countries to respond in ways that are necessary for people's lives to be maintained. Ralph spoke this morning, and he spoke about the importance of people, leadership, and institutions. And I don't know what else to say. We come to these meetings, and we are not getting the needle moving because of the absence of political will that is focused on domestic politics, political will that is focused on geopolitics. I ask myself, what was so special about 1969 that caused the countries of the world to rise to the leadership to introduce special drawing rights? Why are they more than equal to the task of their times than we are to the task of our times, when the crises that we face are significantly greater? I believe that Canada has the potential not just to be a leader on this, but to also start to be able to help us speak truth to power to the remaining few countries who are blocking progress at the World Bank and at the IMF. And I also believe that we have to have the courage to say that the common framework for the treatment of debt is not working. And I would wish that the IMF perhaps can do a study to quantify the costs of the time that it has taken not to get agreement on debt and the consequences to countries, including our own country, Suriname, within this community. And unless we come to the harsh reality that what is on the table is not working, we're not going to get there. The last thing I'll say is that we support the increase of quotas, because the truth is, while the IMF has been a bad word for many, it was in fact the IMF that got the global economy through the last 3 years with the rapid credit facility and with other things. They spent $950 billion, just short of $1 trillion, in being able to stabilize the global economy with the pandemic, and indeed post the war in Ukraine and other things that led to disruption of the supply chain. We understand that, but it is now a time to increase the quotas again, and in an equitable way, which comes back to the governance issues that we raised this morning. So I'll stop here, but I really do believe that if ever there was a time for us to stop talking and acting, it is now, because we need time to do. Giving us the oxygen without the capacity to execute will not get us to the finish line safely. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you very much to members of the press. See you guys a little later.